to Block TV, and today, as always, we are joined by Bitcoin influencer and thought leader Dan Hell. Dan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Dan, the economy is in shambles for the most part, and the government is printing and handing out money. Unemployment's high. They're printing money at a record rate. They're handing out money. Why is Bitcoin not skyrocketing? Isn't this the dream scenario that we've been told about for Bitcoin all along?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when the crisis first came on, once concerns over Corona really sunk in, we saw a huge sell-off in the mainstream markets, including sell-offs in gold and in Bitcoin. And what that represented was a liquidity crunch. As people were levered going into this bull run, when those prices started to drop, they started to get margin called across all their different positions, across all the different assets. And in order to fulfill those margin call requirements, they had to liquidate certain assets that were up, and that included Bitcoin. And so Bitcoin behaved like any other asset during that sort of forced liquidation period and dropped down quite a bit. Bitcoin right now is hovering around 7,000, which isn't too much of a drop from where it was at the beginning of the year, which I believe was around like 8,000 or so, or like I think that's like February, January time. So Bitcoin's performed decently well, all things considered. I mean, this is the first major financial crisis that Bitcoin has been a part of. Bitcoin was born during the 2008 financial crisis, but it had not really been anything other than just code at that point. Bitcoin has performed very well, all things considered, like I just said, especially not just that this is a normal financial crisis or a recession. I mean, this is a full-on once in a half-century sort of movement. I mean, this is incredible in terms of how the magnitude and depth of the damage done here. So Bitcoin has done very well. If we look at gold in the 2008 financial crisis, it took 3, 6, 12 months for it to really start to pick up steam. Gold similarly dropped 30% at the beginning of the 2008 financial crisis. So I think the TLDR is just let's wait a little bit. These usually take time. Concerns over inflation in the economy don't happen in a second. They actually manifest over the course of 6, 12, 18 months.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of this waiting and because these things take time, let's speak about the government's bailout. There's been a lot of spoken about the difficulty that the government's having in actually getting that money that they printed into the actual hands of the people, into the small businesses. People are waiting for those checks. Do you think that this whole situation might help the push for a CBDC going forwards? It would make this problem almost non-existent if the dollar was digital and using these technologies.
Yeah, I think the crisis certainly shows some flaws in our institutions, whether that would be in the United States with testing with the CDC and the FDA due to the onerous centralization created by these entities. Testing was not able to be brought out and done in mass quantities in time enough to test and monitor the virus. Similarly, we look at our financial institutions, whether that be the Treasury of the US and their ability to cut checks, which we're finding just the ability to cut a check is, even though I'm spending 40% of my paycheck in taxes, for some reason the government cannot cut out a check in a reasonable amount of time. And so there are some solutions like central bank currencies, which is what you referenced, that in the future individuals might be able to have an account directly with the Treasury or directly with the Fed or directly with different government institutions. And so I find that pretty fascinating that we're even considering that. There are some very risky implications for if they were to do that. They would essentially, if they were to allow accounts with the government, it's essentially like parking your assets with the most trusted institution in the entire country. And that would cause a capital flight from existing commercial banks into the government, which would be a bit scary on both parts, because then it effectively makes the government the Bank of the US, like for all sort of transactions.
Mm-hmm. And the central bank right now, there are mechanisms that stop them from doing that. The central bank and the Fed works with the retail banks, and the retail banks work with the customers, and I'm sure that they would be able to build some sort of system similar to that. But right now, we just got breaking news that Libra, Facebook's Libra project, just announced major changes to their plan. They originally were going to have a Libra coin backed by a basket of various natural currencies. And obviously, governments and regulators were not happy. Now, Libra, in a show of concessions, they've actually announced that they're going to have separate Libras, each one backed by a single currency. So there'll be a US-backed Libra, there'll be a British pound-backed Libra, as well as plans for a multi-currency Libra that will be backed by those stable coins. What are your takes on that? Have you had a chance to read through that, and what are your takes on that?
I have not been able to read through that yet, but that's an interesting pivot from their original idea. I mean, it's essentially just an extension of it's a banknote in essence, but these are sort of like an extension of existing fiat currencies. And, of course, the word stablecoin is a bit of a misnomer. What they mean is a steady decline in purchasing power.
Yeah, exactly. Especially if it's backed by a government currency.
Correct. Yeah, that's right. So it's more of an extension of these existing fiat currencies. It'll be interesting to see how they push through. It makes sense for them to fragment the individual legal and regulatory burdens per country. That's kind of intuitive. So because, to try to work across all those different jurisdictions would have been near impossible. So I get why they're probably segmenting it, and they're probably building teams per country. And then maybe they can use some of their core infrastructure that's copy-pastable to each different regulatory challenge.
Mm-hmm. But if these reports are true, it kind of takes away a lot of the promise that it held, where it truly could have been. I mean, listen, if you want to focus on the positive, let's ignore the negatives that it could have entailed. But to focus on the positives of what Libra could have been, it could have truly been an easy to use with a good UI UX sort of cryptocurrency built on blockchain solutions that could cross borders. Now, I know it scared the shit out of regulators because it meant that their control of money was taken out of their hands. But as it is now, if it is being pushed simply as just pegged to a US dollar or British pound, does it now hold no threat at all to Bitcoin because it has nothing to do with Bitcoin anymore? It's not truly decentralized. It's nothing like the sort. Is Bitcoin home free now?
I like to try to think of the positive take before I take a negative one. And I think the positive take on Libra that I had initially and then that I talked about on HODL with HODL was that Libra is a top of the funnel sort of user acquisition for Bitcoin. Libra is more of like a Visa and Bitcoin is more like a gold, and those don't necessarily compete. Libra is really focused on the day-to-day transactability, and Bitcoin's focused on the immutable, hard to seize gold, or gold 2.0 or digital gold. And so I think Libra, for the first time, might get people to, one, use digital currency, and two, question the nature of their government. Because if in their Libra wallet, if they're allowed to hold other currencies of other countries, then eventually they start to think, well, what's backing these currencies? How are they controlled? What's the monetary policy? And once they go down that rabbit hole, I think that Bitcoin does become an attractive offer for some of those individuals. So I see it more of as a top of the funnel user acquisition channel for Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. Well, the more people being funneled towards Bitcoin, the better. But on a similar topic, a new report showed that Bitcoin exchange deposits actually hit their lowest point since August 2016. Are we missing something here, or is that the whole story?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting analysis done where they looked at the flow of exchange deposits on and off exchange. I work at Kraken, and these are some interesting patterns that we look at. We look at all sorts of types of user behavior, and look at how that impacts trading. This was an open source study done, so this wasn't done with Kraken. This was just an analysis done and published on a few different crypto publications. And it was really interesting because I think what it indicates is, one, even though exchanges have risen in popularity as kind of the first place that people go to buy their Bitcoin or any other crypto, users are eventually learning the "not your keys, not your coins" slogan, and actually really emphasizing that in their own personal storage. And it seems like users are often pulling their coins off of the exchange when they're not actively trading, which is a great thing because it removes some of that centralized risk and centralized key management. And it's funny because Jesse, the CEO of Kraken, even though Kraken makes money off people depositing coins and then trading with that, he actually encourages our users to go move their coins in self-custody. So Kraken's a very OG crypto sort of company where it's a not your keys, not your coins is really pushed by us. And so this data that was publicly available essentially showed that as the price swings, users pull their money off the exchange when they don't plan on selling. And I think that's a bullish sign for the halving, is that users are indicating that with the halving, they're not bringing more coins to the exchange in order to go sell. They're pulling the coins off of the exchange to hodl and wait.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is good news. The hodlers are hodling strong, especially as the halving comes up. But Bitcoin originally kind of rose out of the ashes of the 2008 financial crisis. A lot of people were angry with the way that the system was working, was kind of bailing out the top 1% and kind of leaving everyone behind. Do you think that something similar here is happening here, where right now a lot of people are seeing the crony capitalism for what it is, where they feel like the shareholders are getting bailed out with the 2.2 trillion, the equity holders are being bailed out, but a lot of the everyman is kind of being left behind. Do you think that this situation could be another big push for Bitcoin and crypto as a whole?
Yeah, I think that the perceived fairness of Bitcoin, when people look back at how Bitcoin was launched by Satoshi and they look back at how the coins were initially distributed and how tons of people just basically lost those coins from that day and almost no one hodled. It's really hard to hodl from when Bitcoin's worth nothing to a penny to 10 cents to $1 to $10 to $100. People are humans after all. They do take some money off the table. So Bitcoin had a fair launch where you didn't have to be accredited to participate. You just had to be there and choose to want to enter into it. Almost a lot of I wouldn't say almost, but a lot of Americans have heard about Bitcoin since it was $10. They just never took the actions to go purchase it. So I think as we see crony capitalism exposed across, and by the way, I'm a big capitalist, but crony capitalism is where the government works alongside some businesses and gives them unequal opportunities. For example, some of these small business loans that are being given out to institutions that don't necessarily need a small business loan. People closest to the money supply, the Cantillon effect, are essentially benefiting from it. And so I think that with these bailouts, we're seeing all of these different interest groups and businesses benefiting from these, what they're calling Corona stimulus packages. And with Bitcoin, all of the transactions are transparent. The launch was transparent. And I think that, it's been funny to see people look at that launch over the years, but I feel like Satoshi wanted to make sure that when people look back on it, they felt it was fair, even before Bitcoin was worth a penny. And so I do hope that when people find Bitcoin, that they'll look at that story and they'll go, you know what, this was as fair as possible. Nothing's ever perfectly fair, but Satoshi tried to level the playing field for everybody.
Mm-hmm. And that's in sharp contrast to the government, where they could kind of choose where they give the money to, and they control the supply. With Bitcoin, that is hard-coded into the software itself, and hard-coded into that is the halving. The Bitcoin halving is about 25 days and a couple of hours away. What are your predictions for Bitcoin price in the lead-up and at the halving, and how do you think it will affect miners who are going to essentially see their rewards cut in half?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, the halving is there'll be a total of 21 million Bitcoin. Those are produced on a certain schedule. Every 4 years, the number of Bitcoin produced drops in half, and that essentially is an asymptotic curve that produces Bitcoins up to 21 million. In those halving events, the block subsidy or the newly minted Bitcoins are dropped in half. And so the miners are compensated with their work. So miners exert proof of work, and that work is compensated by the block reward. The block reward is comprised of the block subsidy plus transaction fees. And so even though we've already had 2 halvings before this, we've seen the block reward increase exponentially in US dollar value, even though the Bitcoin in the block has dropped. And that's because the value of that Bitcoin in USD has been going up and up over time. So typically what we see is, after halving 1 year, 2 years after that, Bitcoin's price starts to rise. And so that essentially helps offset that drop in revenue. Also, we see transaction fees rise over time and increasingly replace the block subsidy in the block reward. And so, and finally, during the moment when these miners encounter less reward for the same amount of work, essentially what Bitcoin has built into it is a self-equilibrating system and there's an adjustment called the difficulty adjustment that does that. So the difficulty adjustment makes it less difficult to earn money or earn that block reward when there are less miners working on Bitcoin's protocol. So when there's more miners working on Bitcoin, the difficulty becomes harder. When there's less, it becomes less. And so essentially that equilibrates the block reward to be distributed only to the miners who stick around and are able to profit even with the drop in revenue.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's kind of the beauty of the system that Satoshi built, where he had the foresight to kind of, to put a good incentive, to put good security. It really is incredible to look at it, years later, and it's really incredible that we don't know who he is, because if we knew who he or she or they were, I would love to buy them a beer. Now, last question, because there's a lot of talk. We were speaking about Bitcoin and its value. The daily average transaction value on Ethereum now is equal to that of Bitcoin at $1.5 billion. Does this number mean anything at all? Does it show how much people are actually using a network, or is it totally meaningless because all the Bitcoiners are actually just hodling their Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on which KPI you use to measure performance. Total value used is a common one on Bitcoin, but again, yeah, the number of hodlers on Bitcoin is the far more important, aggregate metric. When you look at on-chain data, that Ethereum data was actually a little bit flawed. They included all of the stablecoin data, which very much distorts the underlying. They're not talking about the native Ether token. They're talking about all of the stable coins on top of it, which is a bit ridiculous, because Bitcoin never used Tether, which is far greater than all of those other stable coins. Bitcoin, when we look at Bitcoin volume, we never look at Bitcoin volume plus Tether.
Mm-hmm. If we did, that number would be way bigger. And last question for you. Last question before we let you go. You recently played in Peter McCormack's Bitcoin poker tournament. Did you win?
I survived. I got to place. I think I placed 40. So that was 40 out of 260. So I did a decent job. I'm not that amazing of a poker player, but it was a good time. I made it pretty far, out-survived some of the other crypto participants. So I felt proud to get 40. Glad
that you can have some fun in these tough times. Thank you, Dan, so much for joining us. And for all of viewers at home, if you want more on blockchain, crypto, and tech news, make sure to check us out at blocktv.com.
Watch us on Amazon Fire TV and Roku.